In this video, I'm going to do a quick AMG engine tier list. Since I've done a whole series of videos on AMG engines over the years, I've gotten a lot of questions about how I think each of the different AMG engines compare to one another, so I thought putting together a tier list and getting my opinions together would maybe help to answer some of that. So really the criteria for this list is I'm looking how innovative the engine was for its time, as well as how reliable they have been, looking at materials used, looking at packaging, and looking at how the engines sound in the cars that they were in. I'll look at each of the engines as a broader group, so even if there were multiple versions or slight variations of an engine, I'll just put it together. This is again just my opinion from driving different AMGs over the years and doing videos on them. So let me know as I go through this list in the comments if you agree with my choices or where I may be wrong. So I'll start this list in chronological order, so we'll start with M104 as the first engine on this list. This was in the C36AMG, inline-six 3.6 liters. It compared relatively well to the BMW M3. It produced 276 horsepower and good torque. It's a good solid engine, but really AMG was done with inline-sixes by that time. So it's something we would not see again for many, many years. So for all those reasons, I'll start with putting that at the C tier. M119 AMG. So this is really best known for the 6-liter in cars like the SL60 R129, E60 AMG W124. So the M119 in general was a very sophisticated engine for its time. Variable intake valve timing, lightweight materials, aluminum construction, 4 valves per cylinder, and a reliable reputation over the years. Overall, this was a really solid AMG engine for the 1990s, and it's certainly deserving of a B tier in this list. M297. So this is the AMG high-performance version of the M120. Whole load of great things, 7.3 liters, titanium connecting rods. This was also the engine featured in the Pagani Zonda over the years, even up to 2017 with constant revision. And it was also in the CLK GTR, both in 6.9 and 7.3 liter versions. So really you factor all these things together, the fact that it was in the CLK GTR, the fact that it powered so many different Pagani Zonda models over the years, amazing construction, it's a reliable engine. Therefore, this is deserving of S tier. M113. So this was really the replacement for the M119, introduced in the late 1990s. First seen really in the E55 AMG, 5.4 liter, about 350 horsepower. Definitely a solid engine for the time. And the M113 made it all the way up to about 395 horsepower in the SLK 55 Black Series. Its use of materials like aluminum and magnesium kept the weight down. Now some might think it was a bit of a downgrade from the M119 because that was a 4 valve per cylinder engine, this is only 3. But the M113 proved to be a very, very reliable engine over the years. So I think it's certainly deserving of B tier. M137. So AMG's version of the M137 was a bit of an interesting low production project. This engine only really made it into very few cars, like the G63 V12, the S63, and the CL63, and those were all around 2001. So the engine produced 437 horsepower, which was certainly fine for a naturally aspirated V12 at the time. The M137 was plagued with some reliability issues in terms of the engine block, structural things, oiling issues. Really overall, the 137 was a pretty big step down from the M120, and if you're talking AMG, from the M297. So in fact, I would put this all the way down in D tier. M112K. So this was the engine in the C32 AMG, SLK32, 349 horsepower, supercharged 3.2 liter. Quite a good engine, definitely had the power to keep the C32 up with its rivals. And the M112K in the C32 was itself very reliable. How does it compare to AMG's V8s of the time? Not quite as good, especially when it came to the sound of the engine. So I'm going to put that in C tier. M113K. So the M113K produced up to 574 horsepower in the CLK DTM. Obviously 5.4 supercharged, performance engine of the year when it came out in 2003. And the cars it powered, SL55, sold so many units, and a big reason for that was the engine. E55, again, big reason for that was the engine. It wasn't necessarily the most sophisticated thing, the supercharger was, but the engine itself, like the regular M113, single overhead cam, no variable anything, which again, for reliability's sake, the M113K has proven to be a very reliable engine. And if you go watch Tassos Moscato's videos on this engine, he also has a relatively high praise on the structure of this engine and how it handles more boost and things like that. Factor all those things together, I think the M113K easily deserves to be in the A tier. M155. So following the M113K, the M155 is the ultra high performance version of that engine, producing up to 651 horsepower in the SLR Stirling Moss. Compared to the M113K, this thing has a closed deck engine block, much better cooling, dry sump oil, also sounds amazing. It's really kind of a perfected version. It's easily deserving of S tier. M275. So this is AMG's V12 that replaced the M137, and this was a 6-liter V12, twin turbo of course, and it really fixed all of the M137's problems. They went back down to the structure of the engine, they made major improvements, and those improvements were needed because the power levels were so high for the time. 604 horsepower, 738 pound-feet of torque, so truly an impressive engine. It was the 2004 Performance Engine of the Year, and it produced up to 661 horsepower in the SL65 Black Series, even more in the Pagani Huayra. So this engine is easily deserving of A tier. OM612. This was AMG's only diesel engine that they ever developed. And essentially they increased the displacement of the inline 5-cylinder to 3 liters. So the output of this engine was only 228 horsepower, but nearly 400 pound-feet of torque. And yes, it was hand-assembled. The cars that it was in, such as the C30 CDI, sold poorly. The fact that diesel was never done again, I think that means this engine goes into the D tier. M156. So the M156 is probably one of AMG's best known engines if you look at their history, and it's easy to see why. 518 horsepower, 6.2 liter. It's AMG's first engine that they designed themselves, really with a racing development from day one design. Closed deck engine block, ultra hard cylinder walls, 4 valves per cylinder, 2 throttle bodies, amazing sound, smooth operation. There's really a lot to like with this engine. The only thing that would keep the M156 from S tier were the few issues with the cylinder heads. So this engine definitely fits in the A tier. M159. So when we're talking about this engine, it's really the higher performance perfected version of the M156. So up to 622 horsepower in the SLS Black Series, 8,000 RPM in that car. That's the highest output naturally aspirated V8 ever made, and that's a record that probably will never be broken. So I think even just for that fact alone, I think that's an easy S tier on this one. M157. So the M157 5.5 V8 biturbo replaced the M113K in some cars. It replaced the M156 in others. And this was a good engine. It produced great power for the time, up to 577 horsepower in the E63S, lots of torque. This engine was more efficient than its predecessors. But at its fundamentals, it did maybe go backwards in a sense from the M156. It was not as much of AMG's direct development on this engine. It went back to an open deck engine block, and it was much more similar in design actually to the M278, the regular 4.7 biturbo. But again, that's not a bad thing at all. That was also a good engine. People have done good things with modifying these engines, but I have heard about some limitations with its bottom end construction, connecting rods and things like that. And put all those things together, and I think this engine is a strong B tier, if not B+. And the M157's cousin is the M152. This was an engine that was exclusively for the SLK 55. And this produced 415 horsepower. It was a nice sounding, naturally aspirated V8, 5.5 liters. Other than that, it was just an incremental increase over the M113 that was in the first SLK 55. But for its time, it was nothing really game-changing, so I'm thinking C tier for now. M133. So now we're changing it up and going 4 cylinders. This was the next engine by AMG. And this was in the CLA 45 and A45, the first ones. This was actually a pretty well-designed engine, quite a strong design, up to 375 horsepower in a 2-liter, which was really amazing, high output. But it did kind of signify the trend of AMG going towards smaller engines. Of course, the first thing that suffers with that is the sound of the engine. So overall, I think this engine will go D tier for now. Even though it's still a hand-assembled engine, and still, I think reliability has been fine. But in terms of, the things that are valued so much, like sound, the character of the engine, and you think AMG, I think it's D tier for now. Now moving on to M177, the 4.0 V8 bi-turbo, and this engine produced up to 620 horsepower in the GT63, plenty of torque as well. And the M177 is really a well-designed engine from the ground up. This replaced the M157 we discussed earlier, and the M177, it really had some major improvements. Things like a closed deck engine block made a comeback, which was nice. People tuning this engine really are having great results, and overall reliability so far, it's still a relatively new engine, but reliability so far is looking pretty good. It doesn't sound as good as its predecessors, but it really has a lot of good things going for it, so I think the M177 is definitely an A-tier engine. M178. So now we're looking at the high-performance version of the engine we were just talking about, and this was for the AMG GT cars. And so up to 720 horsepower in the GT Black Series. Really impressive design. All M178s are dry sump. AMG is definitely pushing the boundaries with the technology in this engine. But I guess unfortunately it's kind of plagued by the same thing with the M177. It does not sound as good as the AMG's older cars. It's just a simple fact. I'm going to say M178 is also A tier. M276. That's the V6 in the 43 line of cars, up to 385 horsepower. And this is not a hand-built engine by Mercedes. It's really a normal Mercedes engine with a few little tweaks, better tune on it. Not a total write-off because it's a perfectly fine engine. Overall, I'm still going to put in a D tier just because AMG is doing so little anyways. M256. This is an engine I haven't really looked at too much yet, but it's inline-six turbo. Really interesting that Mercedes brought back inline-six, as we've seen way before with the M104. And this engine produces good power. The cars it powers are relatively quick. There's a decent amount to like with this engine. It's still not like hand-assembled at AMG, but I think it's interesting enough, and it sounds okay, that I think I'll put it in C tier for now. M139. This is the engine in the CLA 45, the second generation one. Up to 416 horsepower in the S model. Really impressive for a 2-liter 4-cylinder. It's kind of industry-leading stuff. This engine has an advanced cylinder head, good fuel consumption. It sounds okay given it's a 4-cylinder. I did quite like it in the CLA 45, so I'll go C tier, maybe C+. I don't think it's deserving of B tier. I think B tier is reserved. You need 8 cylinders. You need something that gives a special experience, and I think this engine is technically very capable, very impressive, but it's not quite special enough. I'll go like C+ on this one. And then to finish off, saving the worst for last really, the M260. So that's the A35 engine. This is a 2-liter but much less advanced than the M139 and M133 that we discussed earlier. 302 horsepower in that car, perfectly fine engine, perfectly fine car, but really it's such a small adjustment from the non-AMG version of this engine. It's not an F tier, but it's E tier for sure. I think some of the other engines in D tier are at least somewhat more interesting, somewhat more changed by AMG. So I think that'll have to stay there. Looking at the list now, I'm pretty satisfied with it. I think a lot of these choices are pretty defensible. Looking over the list, M152 is probably the one that sticks out as being too low. So I think that's probably a B tier because M152 is actually not that bad. It sounds pretty nice, naturally aspirated, smooth running engine. So yeah, overall, now I think this list is pretty strong. I think I could defend any of one of these choices. Yes, I think the M137 is, for a naturally aspirated V12, it's quite low. But again, I think it'll have to stay there. The M275 was, worlds better. But yeah, I like this list as it is. Definitely let me know in the comments what you think about this. If you like this video and you want to see more videos like this, subscribe for more, and see you in the next video.